Let's start with what happened in Iowa, folks. And we began with that Al Gore cold open because it's a good reminder that following the rituals and affirming the justness of the system is oftentimes, frankly, just delusional. There was nothing hidden about that process, right? You had a governor of a state who was the brother of the presidential candidate, a secretary of state who favored that presidential candidate. There was numerous technical irregularities and other biases that favored George W. Bush in the state of Florida, and voting was halted before it could be completed because, I kid you not, the Republican Supreme Court, led by then Chief Justice Rehnquist and along with Scalia and others, wrote in a 5-4 decision that fully counting the votes, which would by definition mean that different counties would have different ways of adjudicating ballots and finishing the voting, would be a violation of George W. Bush's 14th Amendment rights. So in other words, people who've dedicated their entire lives to rolling back civil rights in a substantive way, to depreciate voting rights, to lessen equality for African Americans, which is the mission of the Republican Supreme Court, said George W. Bush's rights are threatened by us actually having a democratic process in Florida. That's what happened. They even wrote in the decision, and by the way, we know we're using the 14th Amendment to override a state court, and that's kind of not our thing. So let's just remind everybody, don't use this again. This is a one-off. Al Gore came out and said, well, I disagree. I submit to being ritually ripped off, and I will go and work on carbon neutral toilets, as well as also being on the board of directors of Apple, where he helped sign off on a report that cleared Steve Jobs for some extremely questionable behavior around stock buybacks. But anyways, being as it may, our society is totally rotted. That's the reason I brought that example up. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton ran an arrogant, delusional, massively incompetent campaign that rode on the assumption that she could ignore key parts of the country, hang out at Bono concerts, vacation in Martha's Vineyard, and glide her way to victory. That didn't work out that way. But people pointed out, and they pointed out, by the way, rightly, in the context of the election of Donald Trump, it was important to remind everybody that the Electoral College is totally undemocratic, totally ridiculous, and that Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did. That was important to register. But by the time we got to 2018, these same people who wanted to destroy any project to actually deliver healthcare, solve inequality, deal with the climate crisis, who spent most of their time online either being like, whoa, did you see the way Nancy Pelosi raised her eyebrow at Donald Trump? Or, being on MSNBC saying like, I'll tell you what, here's my thoughts on Bernie Sanders. If the Klan allowed Jewish people, he'd be a leader in it. And that's what concerns me. And then when we responded to it, they would say, oh my God, we're being bullied. All I said was that Bernie would be in the Klan. Why can't people support unity? They used that talking point, even though it was right, to obscure urgent strategic changes that the Democratic Party needed to undertake, and of course to try to undercut the Bernie Sanders movement. But the one positive from that was that it was commonly accepted amongst a lot of people, including people who wouldn't have touched this before generationally. Democrats had not campaigned against the Electoral College even after the monumental screwing of Al Gore in 2000. All of a sudden, it seemed like we had actually reached some form of consensus that the vote winner should be president. Seems pretty obvious. In fact, here is a gentleman who may or may not have been involved in bread price fixing, who may or may not be an asset of the CIA. I know that profoundly offends people at points when I say it, to which I say yawn.
He has intelligence on his resume.
He has intelligence on his resume, and I'm also going to say CIA is a state of mind. Here is Pete Buttigieg campaigning a couple of weeks ago, or in April 2019, making, I think, a pretty fair point.
And at risk of sounding simple-minded, I believe that the best way that a nation like ours should select its national leader is to have an election, count up all the votes, and give it to the woman or man who gets the most.
And I agree with Pete Buttigieg, which is why him declaring victory in Iowa, a state where he lost the popular vote, according to these partial, insane results we're seeing. But insofar as we can measure any of these things, and there's still some conjecture going on because they have not released the totals, but all appearances indicate that Bernie Sanders won more votes than Pete Buttigieg. So I'm going to turn around Pete and say, how dare you go out and declare victory when you had rightly taken the stand that democracy should be determined by a majority, not some convoluted, ridiculous voting process. And in addition to that, I'm sorry, folks, there is absolutely a conversation to be had about incompetence, about double dealing, about an incestuous relationship between the DNC and political consultants. Absolutely. And this isn't some secret Baroque conspiracy. I don't think that there's a secret algorithm to eliminate Bernie votes, because I don't think, frankly, there's Democratic consultants who are competent enough to do something like that. But I would say this. Why is it that every single screw up we're seeing always breaks against Bernie? And in addition to that, look at what's right in front of you. Do you think that if a polling methodology accidentally left Bernie Sanders out of a questionnaire and the Sanders campaign complained to the CNN Des Moines Register that a poll would be spiked? In your fucking dream of dreams. That would never happen. Ever. Do you think that if Bernie Sanders came out on stage after having, by all accounts, won less votes and with no totals fully presented and just said, we won, that the media would give him a 24-hour victory lap and talk about the possibility of the first Jewish president? In your dreams. So whatever terminology we want to use, okay, and I think we just cannot afford too much pedantry about this stuff. There is institutional bias against Bernie Sanders. Now, does that mean that Bernie Sanders cannot win? Does that mean that the movement cannot overcome it? Of course not. Not for a second. But it does mean that there's profound institutional bias here. And I'm also not going to question people. I don't want you to go fully in a conspiracy rabbit hole, because that is disempowering. If you really have it was written view of the world, you're not going to get anything done. However, if you're not looking around and saying, like, that is weird. Why does this consulting firm have a relationship with Buttigieg? Why does what is going on here? And in a really concrete way, look at the reporting on the LIBOR score that came out several years ago. LIBOR was supposed to be an unimpeachable gold standard of global financial markets. That could never be manipulated. Ooh, no. And when they discovered it, of course, it was manipulated. It wasn't because there was a secret cabal that was controlling it. It was because people knew each other. There was one report of LIBOR price fixing where some guy calls up somebody involved in the score, says, hey, can you help me out with blah, blah, blah? The guy says, okay, how about you take me out for a sushi lunch? I'll help you out. So you have to start filtering it through the fact that Sanders is on the outside of that dynamic. So if there's favors to be called in, if there's jump balls to be played, if there's splits, if there's decisions to be made like that, they're going to go against him. Just as an example, as I said before, we all know that there's no way in hell that the Des Moines Register or CNN would spike a poll because the Bernie Sanders campaign is complaining. Now, by all accounts, Sanders had a successful night there, and he heads into New Hampshire with extraordinary momentum. He was attacked across the board with lies, despicable smears. There was a shadowy group promoting vicious lies against Bernie Sanders about Israel that enlisted some premium or very old Democratic talent. People are right to have doubts about the process. We don't want to enter conspiratorial territory, but the fact that the Democratic establishment hired a group of people incapable of developing this platform should alone be bad enough. Tom Perez needs to resign now. Over the years, there's been a total erosion of the party's power and local and state institutions. And today, with a clown fascist Donald Trump in power, the Democratic Party has been content with symbolic gestures like ripping up his speech while passing horrific military budgets, a Space Force, a new NAFTA, a renewed Patriot Act, and funding for the border wall, ICE, and detention facilities. Bernie Sanders and our movement have momentum. Against us, we have billionaire class, a party establishment that's fine with keeping the status quo so long as they maintain their elite position in contracts. And their incompetence and failure in Iowa shows that since they control the party in the primary system, they have enough power that whether by intention or simply utter incompetence, they can harm and undermine not only the Sanders campaign, but the legitimacy of the entire process. We need to be vigilant, we need to be committed, and we need to continue to grow and expand the movement we've been building over years that has brought us to the position today, because our opponents cannot be trusted to deliver us victory against the far right. Bernie won. Keep fighting. Feel optimistic. And there is no room. People get triggered by this. I'll try to put this in a diplomatic way as possible. If you have any inkling of this, whether you're more of like a centrist liberal type who's identified with Warren, but you really want some of these changes, whether you've identified with Gabbard or Yang, there is a coalescing now of one candidate who has a shot of actually taking on this party establishment and the establishment in general. And if that's what you're interested in doing, it's Bernie Sanders. You guys have anything you want to add?
I just want to make the comparison, whether or not the thing is the incompetence versus malice sort of thing is, I think that definitely capitalism doesn't select for talent, and there's not a meritocracy, and people at the top of the Democratic Party making these decisions aren't that competent.
No.
But I also think that, like, to think about this in disaster capitalism terms, this is like sort of disaster authoritarianism, and authoritarianism, as we know, comes from the center. And so whether or not like the chaos that happened originally was intentional, they're in control of the chaos. So they're in control of dolloping out results that they have. Like, they get to control what gets leaked to the press about things. They get to control spin. Like, I'm looking at this article. This was before, this is at 2:44, so way before the actual caucuses. And like what the party's saying here is, like, the Iowa Democratic Party said it is aware of the problems, but stressed it would not affect the reporting of the results. Like, just bullshitting, right? Like, right. And I think the thing to point out is the pattern that it keeps effing Bernie. And of course there's a selection bias here, right? Because we probably, like, some guy called in and said he was able to steal a delegate as a Bernie supporter for the, he called him the majority report coverage. So like this coin flips and like the small ball stuff, I'm sure
definitely.
Like occasionally
some of those will break for Bernie, of
but
course.
At the same time, this is the stuff where the actual people controlling the levers of this party, I mean, yeah.
Do you doubt for a second? Look, I'll say this, this is me. I say what I think on every platform, but I'll present it, in different ways on different platforms. Always what I think, but with different presentations. So the rawest thing I could say here is, do you really think for a second, if there was information that they could glean that Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden or frankly Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar had won this caucus, that we would be in this process? No. Sorry. I mean, I think it's very likely, clearly, that Pete Buttigieg's strategy of dumping an obscene amount of money here led him to overperform. I also think spiking that poll led him to overperform. But there is no doubt in my mind that if these numbers did not show that at the end of the day, more human beings went into the Iowa caucuses and caucused for Bernie Sanders, that we would have all of this information. Period. Full stop.
I think that's exactly the point that we need to be making about, these vote totals and like the slow rollout. There's obviously is, an intention to try to stifle any enthusiasm or momentum that there is for Bernie Sanders. I just wanted to add to Matt's point too, is like, you look at this organization that made this app, and it really does show the fundamental problem with the Democratic Party. So you have what is a democratic process, right? Which is people going to the caucusing and voting, and there's problems we have with caucuses, whatever, right? But this is like a democratic activity. And the Democratic Party now is saying, well, what's a way that we can have our friends profit from it? And it's a serious problem within, DC, is that you have all of these like progressive grassroots organizations who profit immensely from the coffers of the Democratic Party for trying to, come up with new ways to innovate the system. I'm not against, changing and making things more efficient or whatever, but for the most part, these are very bloated contracts. And as we saw, in Iowa, they don't always deliver. Often they don't. And they're not hiring the best people. They're hiring their friends. They're hiring, from what I've seen from the reports on Shadow, most of the people working on this platform didn't even have any like coding or app development experience in the first place.
This is an area where, look, maybe I'm open to somebody who actually knows something to tell me something. Maybe, but I'm dubious. These are, they're problems in search, they're solutions in search of a problem. There's nothing, we don't need this app. As evidenced by the fact, by the way, that all other Iowa caucuses have gone better than this. Yeah. Like, we don't need all of this nonsense.
Well, let me just continue reading this
please.
quote from Mandy McClure, the party spokeswoman. The IDP is working with any precinct chairs who want to use the optional tabulation applications to make sure they are comfortable with it. Like, portraying it as if it was just some optional thing. I don't know. It's so infuriating.
It's infuriating. It's disgusting. It's ridiculous. And that's a big problem too. Look, there's whole infrastructure. We've seen this with some groups and how they chose to endorse in ways that are totally antithetical to their professed policy set. And my strong suspicion would be that has a relationship with how contracts are going to get doled out and things like this. And this is another thing to underline about the Sanders campaign. Yes, if we want to be pedants about it, it's not literally revolutionary. The policy set is not particularly radical. But the bottom line is that it does threaten capital, and it does threaten a lot of people, including people who'd like to be branded as having fairly progressive profile. It threatens an ecosystem they're in. And it's an ecosystem that works for them, but it doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for us. All right. And that's, and I think that, what really also enrages me, don't go out and be a pure conspiracy theorist and not participate. That's exactly what they want. But they also want people to be acting like mini Al Gores on Twitter. Like, it's totally okay. And I wish I was more competent, but I would just like to say that, honest mistakes. And before we even get to New Hampshire, I commit to voting for Michael Bloomberg in the general election, even though there's Bloomberg consultants who serve on the DNC Rules Committee. That's another thing. Like, there are people who can. Okay, the DNC Rules Committee has Barney Frank, who sits on a bank board and hates Bernie Sanders personally. There are consultants who are getting paid by Mike Bloomberg while they sit on this committee. At a certain point, you just have to look at observable reality in front of your face and question the institutional biases and get real about it. You don't think that on a concrete level, whose phone calls get returned? How do things actually work? And you need to go out and demand of every single candidate, will you support the delegate lead candidate? Period. That's the question. I don't care what the technical rules are. I don't give a fuck. Bernie Sanders has 30% of the delegates, and Michael Bloomberg goes, all of a sudden I bought everybody mansions and they gave me this. And then people will say, oh, well, it was technically legal because 50% threshold. No.
Yeah.
No, we're not doing that. I don't care what's technical.
The closer this looks, the more your ability to be in Milwaukee for that convention, the more important it's going to be, whether it's in the streets or, whatever you
Absolutely.
can do.
Whatever
there.
way you can participate.
Because they're not going to just allow Bernie, they're going to try to fuck him.
They're going to try to fuck him. And this is another thing with, look, hope springs eternal. I want to say, I don't want to I probably already have, but look, there's some people who support Warren as an example, the good faith, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't have any personal animosity, but I hope people can finally see that candidacy is not helping get this done. And the fantasy that they're going to team up, I hope the smear from a couple of weeks ago has disabused people of that. And the focus here should not be on all these, like, people create all these weird mental gymnastic. We want both of these people in, and then we're going to, and then what's going to happen is Bernie's going to win here, and then she's going to win there, and then they're going to make a call, and then it's going to be like a scene in a movie. Like, no, this is a uphill struggle against the oligarchy of this country. There's one candidate that challenges it structurally, and if you want to overcome that bias, you need that person to win and win decisively, because they will pull a lot of tricks in the book to make that not happen.
They threw Debs in prison.
They threw Eugene Debs in prison.
Just historically.
Just be aware. And this is not some, like, this isn't the West Wing. This isn't Harry Potter. This isn't the amount of energy. I had so much. It's one of the reasons I'm trying to be sincere here about Elizabeth Warren supporters. I could deal with. I totally disagreed, but people just said, well, I don't like Bernie, and I like the blog posts, and that's who I want. Cool. Let's have it out. Let's see who convinces more people. That's a campaign. But people who are like, I can't. Well, obviously. Well, and of course, it only went one way. You should never criticize her. Of course, he can be criticized and lied about and defamed constantly. But it was just a fantasy world. If they were together, then they wouldn't be running against each other.
Exactly.
Like what? It's like I don't know what people's like. Keep it simple. They're running against each other. There's a deal. That deal happens later. And by the way, that deal could happen with anybody. Okay? Oh my God. Just it's very serious, and we can't have any naivete about this.
And it's just like, we are in this very historic moment where we are literally seeing the environment of the planet crumble. We are seeing people unable to afford health care. We're seeing people, living in with stagnant
Oh,
wages.
you're saying that Elizabeth Warren wants the planet to crumble? Why don't you spend more time criticizing Joe Biden?
Well, then, the point is that the differences matter. And if Bernie Sanders is pushing a Green New Deal that's radical and Elizabeth Warren is sort of tacitly behind it, then there's a difference, because we are going up against a right-wing Republican army that is determined to do nothing about this. And we think that just kind of tacit support for these things, I believe global warming is real. That's good enough? No, you need a plan to deal with this. You need a movement to do it and to put it in place as well. And they've completely refused to engage on that level of, the debate. And now this kind of argument that they're saying, and that we don't need to do politics in this moment where the only solution to it is mass democratic strategy and movements of mass amounts of people is ridiculous. And it shows that the Democratic Party, for the most part, is completely out of any kind of imagination for how to deal with this crisis. The Democratic Party, fundamentally, they just run as the opposite to the Republican Party. They're saying hey, the Republican Party is a mess. We're not that. That's not good enough. We also need to be saying we're doing something else, and we're going to change the direction of this country dramatically.
Well, I'm
scoffing
you
at
say
this
that,
article
David.
You just pulled up, not what David was saying. Sorry.
Yeah, David says this, but has he read the new
David
Joan?
says this, but has he read Joan Walsh's Fantasy Life?
Elizabeth Warren has a movement. You just don't see it yet.
Oh, wow. Well, when do we get to see this?
Was it the silent majority?
Do we get to see this at the
silent movement?
Do we get to see this at the protest after Trump is reelected? Do we get to see this at the second Women's March, the day after this motherfucker gets a second term sworn in? What is wrong with people?
Elizabeth Warren has an invisible Supreme Court justice.
Oh my God. And the people, and the last thing I'll say too is that the people who really, if you leaned into this unity rhetoric, then I don't want to hear a bad word about anybody. You should be, well, gee golly, Joe Biden has experience, and oh boy, golly ho, Bernie Sanders got plans, and ooh, gee, look at Elizabeth Warren with the plans, and Bernie with the energy. Nothing but positives for everybody. Nothing but positives for everybody. I don't agree with that position, because the crisis is so deep and we need to deal with it, because it's not just Trump, it's Trump and Trump-like things globally. But if you simply have on your agenda remove Donald Trump, you should not have a bad word to say about any of these people running for president. Full stop. Full stop. You should have talking points prepared for every single Democratic candidate that puts them in the best light as possible. And I mean everyone. I mean Amy Klobuchar. I mean Tulsi Gabbard. I mean Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg. If that's your view, it should be all positive all the time. It should be the O network of political coverage. Okay? If that's not your view, and that is pretty much no one's view, then shut the fuck up and have the argument. Stop being passive aggressive and stop trying to emotionally manipulate people. And I'm not going to do the whole, I'll say real quick, I'm not going to do the whole, like, look, I will always advocate that people vote in such a way that will prevent a Donald Trump second term. But I am genuinely unconvinced at this point of how much energy could be put, even just ethically, into a Mike Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg nonsense general election campaign. One, they'll lose. People are totally unserious about where we're at. And two, they are not going to change any of the parameters of where we're at. That's reality. And if you don't start to see that we better start changing these parameters because the clock is ticking, you're in a different type of delusion, but you're as delusional as these Trump MAGA idiots.
And from our perspective, or from the Chapo's, there's a credibility trade-off, right?
Right.
Like, the whole reason people value what the fuck we say is because we don't shift and all of a sudden start pitching Mike Bloomberg to people.
And I did it. I mean, look, I didn't pitch. Go back to the
Well, you just go negative
I never-
on Trump.
Yeah, I just go negative on Trump. I didn't pitch Hillary Clinton. I might have found a few,
That's the thing.
but it was like, okay, look, it was like Adolf Reed. He said, you got to vote for the lying warmonger. It's important. That was my view.
Look, if the Democratic Party wants to put Mike Bloomberg on top of the ticket, and he beats Trump, fine. But selecting him to do that should already have implicit in it that you don't need any help from people like us.
Precisely. There you go.
Yeah, they've decided.
Go take care of business.
They've
Put us
decided-
on the sidelines.
Yeah, go take care of business.
And the fact
I'm drinking Gatorade.
is that we're the people with momentum, like we're the movement that has momentum. And even if it's not enough momentum to get over one of the most a process that is just so it's ridiculous when you think about the kind of stuff that Bernie Sanders has to go through. I mean, even this is a small thing, but even on ABC, when I was watching the coverage on Iowa, their anchor was like, well, now we're going to turn to the Bernie bros. And they went to Bernie Sanders, campaign party. And you just sit there and say, God, this is so slanderous what they're pushing right now. And it's subtle in the way that they do it, but it just shows how much the deck is stacked against us. And, we're doing this and we're pushing back against this system. And to just think that after that, we just have to sit down and shut up. It's ridiculous.
Speaking of Bernie bros, we know that in Iowa, to the extent it's been measured, the people of color voting in the Iowa caucuses cleaned up for Bernie Sanders. And that's another thing too, that the very last thing I'll say, I am beyond sick of this talking point. Bernie has by far the most multiracial coalition of any candidate. And you know what? To the extent that there's splits inside that, it reflects other class dynamics. And if you don't see that different groups have dynamism and distinctions within themselves, then you're an essentialist, you're an idiot, and you're probably using it in an extremely cynical way to silence tons of people's voices. Shuja Haider, data showing Sanders won Muslims, Hispanics, and Africans Americans in Iowa, and somehow we're only going to hear about white podcasters or whatever. I mean, there it is. There it is. And I mean, even me, I will probably not be maintaining this, but I've tried to make some differences. I really don't believe in demonizing average voters. Yeah. So I think you can critique, of course, there's a coalition of Pete and Warren that I have a problem with. I don't think affluent professional class liberals should be dominating Democratic Party politics. I don't think that's healthy. But do I not see, the woman in her 60s that I talked to who really wants the historical nature of a woman president? Of course I see that. Do I want people who even, Buttigieg, who literally has nothing to recommend him from my viewpoint, understand, wow, a gay man is here. I see that. And these people spend their whole day not only erasing, of course, it goes without saying that we'll engage in a massive exercises of racism and sexism to erase the Sanders coalition. But frankly, the other part of it is fucking lame too. Like, yeah, there's some whites podcasters that support Bernie Sanders. Good. It's awesome that there's media professionals who make a living pontificating, who actually advocate an agenda that has solidarity with Brazil and Iran and wants to give people health care. What the fuck are you doing? I see a lot of white media professionals who are outside every single day fighting to deprive people of health insurance for their own personal neurosis and career advances. Let's talk about those podcasters and media analysts. I know a white guy on MSNBC who is undermining an entire Democratic movement because of an imaginary friends he had in the 1970s, and that's political analysis. You know, and if Bernie Bros exist, awesome. That's great. Good. There's bros who want people to have health care. Awesome. Thank you, Bernie Bros. Thanks. The fuck is wrong with people?
I was gonna say too. It's like probably one of like the most like typically like violent, dangerous groups of people, which is like young men. If like all these young men were just walking around trying to sign people up for Medicare for all, being anti-war, like
hey bro, is there any way you could help us out? We're trying to prevent war with Iran. Whoa, it's horrible. Oh my God, it's so male.
Yeah, using toxic masculinity to stop war with Iran.
Someone tweeted, they asked Joy Reid what the credentials of her body language expert were and asked if she could stop doing anti-Semitic dog whistles against Bernie. Whoa, the bro. It's all passive-aggressive, disingenuous, dishonest, sociopathic bullshit. And I'm not indulging any of it. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.